Please, stop! Please, he's just helping me!
I warned you. This is what happens when you disobey. See?
Disabled veteran and service dog, tasered by transit police, the city's reaction was unforgettable. The number 47 MetroLine bus lurched to a stop at Fifth and Cedar as Army veteran Michael Santos carefully navigated the steps with his golden retriever service dog Liberty pressed close against his right leg to provide balance support for his prosthetic left limb. The morning commute to his VA appointment was routine, something Michael had worked for 2 years to accomplish independently after losing his leg and gaining crippling PTSD from an IED blast in Kandahar. "Hey, you can't bring that dog on my bus," shouted driver Tom Bradley, his voice cutting through the diesel fumes and passenger conversations. "Health regulations, no animals allowed except guide dogs for the blind." What happened next would be captured in shocking 4K video by teenager Marcus Chen, whose live stream of transit police tasering both a disabled veteran and his service dog would generate 25 million views in 6 hours, destroy careers, and force a city to confront its systematic failure to protect the very citizens who had protected America. The crack of 50,000 volts would echo through more than just a city bus. It would reverberate through City Hall, the police department, and the conscience of a community that had failed its heroes. Metro City, Pennsylvania, 2025, the post-industrial city of 180,000 residents was struggling to reinvent itself after decades of manufacturing decline, its public transportation system serving as lifeline for working families, elderly residents, and disabled citizens who couldn't afford private vehicles. The MetroLine buses were old but functional, their accessibility features mandated by federal law, but their operators often undertrained in disability accommodation and civil rights requirements. Staff Sergeant Michael Santos embodied the challenging transition from military service to civilian independence, his 34 years carrying visible and invisible wounds from 2 deployments to Afghanistan, where his role as a combat medic had saved dozens of lives, before an IED explosion outside Kandahar changed everything. The blast had taken his left leg below the knee, while leaving him with traumatic brain injury symptoms that made crowds, loud noises, and confrontational situations feel like active combat zones requiring constant vigilance. Liberty represented 3 years of intensive training and a $45,000 investment in therapeutic partnership that had transformed Michael's life from housebound isolation to functional independence. The Golden Retriever's tasks included providing mobility stability when his prosthetic caused balance issues, detecting the onset of panic attacks through biochemical changes, creating protective barriers during PTSD episodes, and performing room searches that satisfied Michael's combat condition need to assess environments for threats. Their partnership had been forged through 18 months of rigorous training that taught them to function as a single unit, with Liberty's presence making the difference between Michael living independently and requiring institutional care that would have destroyed both his dignity and his family's financial stability. The relationship transcended companionship to encompass medical necessity that enabled his work as a peer counselor at the VA, helping other veterans navigate disability services. Bus driver Tom Bradley represented the institutional ignorance that plagued public transportation workers, whose training on disability accommodation consisted of a brief video about wheelchair accessibility, while their understanding of service animal law was limited to stereotypes about guide dogs for blindness. His 12 years driving MetroLine routes had taught him to maintain schedules and avoid liability, but his knowledge of federal civil rights requirements was practically non-existent. Transit police officers Derek Mills and Kevin Foster embodied the post-9/11 security mindset that had transformed civilian law enforcement into paramilitary operations where compliance was enforced through intimidation rather than education. Mills, a 7-year veteran of transit policing, had been trained to view disruptions as potential threats requiring immediate control, while Foster's 2 years on the force had taught him to support his partner's decisions regardless of their legal or constitutional validity. The broader context was a transportation system designed for able-bodied passengers whose needs fit standard procedures where accommodation requests were viewed as inconveniences rather than federal obligations. The post-pandemic emphasis on health regulations had created additional suspicion of animals in public spaces, while budget constraints had eliminated training programs that might have prevented civil rights violations. Marcus Chen, the 17-year-old whose live stream would document the assault, represented a generation that instinctively recorded injustice while possessing the social media sophistication to transform local incidents into national conversations. His afternoon commute home from Metro Community College was routine until he noticed the confrontation developing between the veteran and bus driver. His decision to begin streaming, reflecting teenage instincts about authority, accountability. The collision between Michael's accommodation needs and institutional ignorance was building toward a confrontation that would test whether federal disability law had any meaning when enforced by people who viewed service animals as pets and disabled veterans as problems, rather than citizens whose rights were protected by laws written in blood spilled on foreign battlefields. The MetroLine bus that should have been Michael's path to independence was about to become the stage for civil rights violations that would shock a community into recognizing how far it had fallen from its proclaimed values of supporting those who had served. The morning had begun with Michael's careful preparation for what had become a semi-weekly journey to the VA Medical Center for his ongoing treatment, PTSD counseling, prosthetic adjustments, and the kind of medical care that kept him functional in civilian life. His independence in using public transportation represented 2 years of therapeutic progress, with Liberty's partnership making it possible for him to navigate crowded buses without the panic attacks that had once left him housebound. "Liberty work mode," Michael commanded quietly as they approached the bus stop, his service dog immediately shifting into the heightened alertness that indicated she was monitoring for stress indicators, environmental threats, and the mobility support needs that Michael's prosthetic leg and balance issues required. Her positioning was textbook professional, close enough to provide immediate assistance, but positioned to avoid interfering with other passengers or normal bus operations. The number 47 bus arrived on schedule, its wheelchair lift and accessibility features representing federal mandates that had made public transportation theoretically accessible to disabled citizens like Michael. His boarding was careful but routine, with Liberty positioned to provide stability as he navigated steps that his prosthetic made challenging but not impossible with proper support and practice. "Excuse me, sir," Michael addressed the driver politely as he showed his monthly transit pass. "Liberty is my service dog trained to assist with my combat-related disabilities. I have documentation if you need to see it. His approach was professional and educational, drawing on experience, helping other veterans navigate similar situations through his peer counseling work. Tom Bradley's reaction was immediate and hostile, revealing ignorance about service animal law that was common among transportation workers who received minimal disability training. "I don't care what you call it, that's a dog, and dogs aren't allowed on city buses except guide dogs for blind people. Health department regulations, and I'm not getting in trouble with my supervisor." The explanation Michael offered was patient and comprehensive, his military bearing helping him maintain composure despite the public humiliation of having his federal rights challenged. "Sir, the Americans with Disabilities Act protects service animals for many types of disabilities, not just blindness. Liberty is trained to provide mobility assistance and PTSD support that I need to function independently." But Bradley's response revealed institutional prejudice that treated all accommodation requests as fraud attempts. "Look, buddy, I've heard every sob story and seen every fake service dog vest you can buy online. That animal looks aggressive, and I'm not responsible if it attacks someone. Either it goes off the bus or you both go off the bus." The confrontation was escalating as other passengers began taking sides, some supporting Michael's obvious legitimacy, while others expressed concern about animal hygiene and safety. The morning commute was becoming a public debate about disability rights, with Michael caught in the middle of ignorance and prejudice that his military service had never prepared him to combat. "I understand your concerns about fraudulent service animals," Michael replied with the patience that his counseling work had taught him to maintain, "but I have comprehensive documentation from the VA, and Liberty's behavior is clearly professional. She's not aggressive, she's trained to be protective without being threatening." The crisis deepened when Bradley radioed for transit police backup, his call coded as "disruptive passenger" with unauthorized animal refusing compliance with safety regulations. The language guaranteed that responding officers would arrive prepared for confrontation rather than accommodation, setting up exactly the kind of authority conflict that Michael's PTSD made unbearable. Marcus Chin's decision to begin live streaming was instinctive rather than calculated, his teenage understanding of viral content telling him that something significant was developing, while his generation's comfort with documenting everything provided the technology that would make accountability possible. "This bus driver is refusing to let a veteran on with his service dog," Marcus narrated quietly to his phone's camera, his commentary providing context for viewers who were about to witness federal civil rights violations in real time. "The dog is clearly working, and the guy's got a prosthetic leg. This is crazy." The setup was complete for confrontation that would test whether Michael's military service had earned him protection or persecution from the civilian institutions he had sworn to defend. The situation deteriorated rapidly when transit officers Mills and Foster boarded the bus with the tactical approach that had become standard for civilian law enforcement hands, near weapons aggressive posturing, and the assumption that civilian resistance required immediate dominance rather than patient investigation. Their entrance created exactly the kind of threatening environment that Michael's PTSD programming interpreted as combat danger requiring defensive responses. "Sir, we need you and that animal off this bus immediately," Officer Mills announced without introduction or inquiry about the nature of Liberty's presence, his tone suggesting that he'd already decided the situation required enforcement rather than education. The driver reports you're refusing to comply with transit regulations regarding unauthorized animals. Michael's response was respectful but firm, drawing on military training that emphasized proper procedures with authority figures while asserting legitimate rights. Officers, Liberty is my service dog trained to assist with my combat-related disabilities. Federal law guarantees her access to public transportation, and I have comprehensive documentation from the VA proving her legitimacy. The documentation he offered was overwhelming. In its completeness, VA disability letters detailing his PTSD and mobility limitations, Liberty's training certificates from a DoD-approved program, and laminated cards explaining federal service animal law in terms that any law enforcement officer should understand. The paperwork exceeded legal requirements while proving the medical necessity that made their separation potentially dangerous. But Officer Foster's reaction revealed training gaps that left law enforcement unprepared to distinguish between legitimate service animals and fraudulent pets. We don't care what papers you got. If the driver says the animal has to go, then it has to go. Transit authority overrides whatever federal nonsense you're talking about. The legal ignorance was staggering and dangerous, with armed officers asserting authority they didn't possess, while dismissing federal civil rights law as nonsense that couldn't override local transit regulations. Marcus's live stream captured every word, while his viewer count climbed toward thousands as social media algorithms recognized compelling content. The escalation accelerated when Michael, overwhelmed by confrontation with multiple authority figures in a confined space, began experiencing the physiological symptoms that indicated an impending PTSD episode. His breathing became rapid and shallow. His hands began trembling, and his peripheral vision started tunneling as combat memories merged with present circumstances in ways that felt completely real and immediately threatening. Liberty's response was immediate and professional. The golden retriever moving into position to provide deep pressure therapy while creating a protective barrier between Michael and the perceived threats that her training had taught her to recognize and manage. Her behavior was textbook service dog intervention, but to officers ignorant about disability accommodation, it appeared to confirm assumptions about aggressive animals requiring neutralization. "The dog's getting aggressive," Officer Mills shouted as he drew his taser, his threat assessment based on complete ignorance about service dog behavior rather than actual aggression indicators. "Everyone stand back. I'm neutralizing the threat before someone gets hurt." Michael's desperate attempt to explain Liberty's medical function was hampered by his deteriorating psychological condition, his words becoming fragmented as the PTSD episode that his service dog was trying to prevent overwhelmed his cognitive processing. "She's helping, not attacking. Medical alert. Please don't hurt her." But Officer Foster's interpretation was that Michael's distress proved the dog was causing problems rather than treating them. "See the animals making him more agitated. We need to separate them before this gets worse." His understanding of the situation was completely backward. Liberty was providing intervention that was preventing rather than causing Michael's psychological crisis. The passenger's reaction was immediate and vocal, with multiple riders recognizing that they were witnessing something wrong and dangerous. Their protests created additional chaos that officers interpreted as crowd control problem rather than moral outrage at obvious civil rights violations being committed against a disabled veteran. "That's a service dog," shouted elderly passenger Margaret Rodriguez, whose grandson had PTSD from Iraq deployment. "You can't treat a veteran like this. That dog is trying to help him." Her words were echoed by a dozen other voices as the bus erupted in condemnation of police behavior that violated basic human decency. Marcus's live stream was capturing every moment, while his commentary provided crucial context. "These transit cops are about to tase a veteran service dog that's trying to help with a panic attack. This is insane. Everyone on the bus is telling them to stop." The moment of maximum crisis was approaching as Officer Mills prepared to deploy his taser against Liberty, whose protective positioning over her handler was being interpreted as aggressive behavior requiring immediate neutralization. The electrical assault that was about to occur would traumatize Michael, potentially injure Liberty, and create the kind of documented civil rights violation that would force institutional accountability. "Last warning, control that animal or we'll control it for you." Mills commanded his finger on the taser trigger, while Liberty maintained her protective stance over Michael, whose PTSD episode was escalating toward levels that required exactly the kind of intervention that police ignorance was about to prevent through violence. The confrontation was building toward explosive conclusion as trained law enforcement officers prepared to assault a disabled veteran and his service animal for exercising federally protected rights, while a busload of witnesses documented every second of civil rights violations that would soon be viewed by millions of Americans who thought they lived in a country that honored rather than persecuted its wounded warriors. The assault began with the crackling discharge of Officer Mills's taser 50,000 volts coursing through Liberty's body as she collapsed in convulsions while her agonized yelps echoed through the bus. The service dog, who had been performing trained medical intervention, was now writhing on the floor, her nervous system disrupted by electrical trauma that could permanently damage her ability to provide the life-saving assistance that Michael depended on for survival. "No, you killed my dog," Michael screamed as he instinctively moved toward Liberty, his combat veteran's protective instincts overriding the PTSD episode that had been building as he witnessed his lifeline being tortured by people who claimed to serve and protect. But his movement toward his service animal was interpreted by Officer Foster as aggressive resistance requiring additional force. The second taser deployment sent electrical current through Michael's body, the shock disrupting his already compromised nervous system while triggering the kind of traumatic flashback that Liberty's presence had been preventing for 3 years. The prosthetic leg that marked his military sacrifice became irrelevant as 50,000 volts dropped him beside his service dog, both victims convulsing on the bus floor. They just tasered a veteran, and his service dog, Marcus's live stream, captured in horrifying detail, his voice carrying over the chaos as passengers erupted in outrage at witnessing something unprecedented: disabled veteran being electrocuted for seeking accommodation that federal law guaranteed. This is happening right now on Metro City Bus. Both of them are down. The immediate aftermath was chaos as the bus erupted in condemnation from passengers who understood they had witnessed civil rights violations of the most egregious kind. The elderly woman who had tried to defend Michael was now crying, while other riders began shouting demands for medical attention and accountability from officers who stood over their victims with weapons drawn. "Call an ambulance, get paramedics," demanded college student Jennifer Walsh, whose cell phone was also recording the assault. "That man's a veteran who lost his leg serving this country, and you just tortured him for having a medical service dog. This is police brutality." But Officers Mills and Foster's response revealed institutional defensiveness that prioritized self-protection over medical necessity or basic human dignity. Passengers need to calm down and clear the area. The subjects were non-compliant with lawful orders and posed a threat to public safety. We used appropriate force to maintain order. The justification was both legally wrong and morally bankrupt, with documented evidence contradicting every aspect of their narrative. Marcus's video showed Michael exercising federal rights, while Liberty performed obvious medical functions, neither displaying any behavior that could justify electrical assault by law enforcement officers. The darkest moment came when both Michael and Liberty remained motionless, except for involuntary muscle spasms, their shared trauma creating the exact medical emergency that proper accommodation was designed to prevent. The partnership that had enabled Michael's independence was potentially destroyed by 30 seconds of institutional ignorance and authorized violence. The viral explosion was immediate and unstoppable, as Marcus's live stream was shared across every social media platform, with veteran abuse and our service dog torture trending nationally within hours. The footage reached 5 million views before emergency medical technicians even arrived, generating outrage that crossed political lines and forced immediate responses from officials who understood they were facing accountability crisis. The medical assessment that followed was devastating, with paramedics documenting electrical trauma that had exacerbated Michael's existing neurological conditions, while potentially causing permanent damage to Liberty's ability to perform the service tasks that kept her handler functional. The EMT supervisor's report would become evidence in federal prosecutions that could destroy careers and cost taxpayers millions. Both victims show signs of severe electrical trauma complicated by pre-existing medical conditions. EMT Patricia Martinez reported while treating injuries that should never have occurred. The veteran has traumatic brain injury that makes him particularly vulnerable to neurological damage from taser deployment, while the service animal is displaying symptoms consistent with nervous system impairment. The institutional failure was complete as Metro City Transit's management arrived to find their officers had committed federal crimes against a disabled veteran while creating liability that could bankrupt the transportation system. The bus that was supposed to provide access to essential services had become the scene of civil rights violations that would require federal intervention. The personal tragedy extended beyond physical injury to psychological trauma that threatened to undo years of recovery progress. Michael's trust in civilian institutions was shattered, along with his confidence in using public transportation, while Liberty's neurological damage might prevent her from ever again providing the medical assistance that had made his independence possible. The community's moral crisis was equally profound as residents confronted evidence that their public servants had tortured a disabled veteran whose sacrifice had earned protection rather than persecution. The footage forced uncomfortable questions about institutional prejudice and the gap between proclaimed support for veterans and actual understanding of their accommodation needs. The transformation began when Mayor Patricia Williams arrived at Metro General Hospital, where Michael and Liberty were being treated. Her unprecedented personal intervention, driven by both moral outrage and recognition that her city was facing the kind of civil rights crisis that could destroy municipal credibility and financial stability. Her decision to take direct control represented the kind of leadership accountability that had become rare in American politics, but was essential for surviving the public relations catastrophe that Marcus's viral video had created. What happened to Staff Sergeant Santos and his service dog represents a complete failure of our city's commitment to serving those who served us, Mayor Williams announced during an impromptu press conference outside the hospital's emergency department. The officers responsible have been immediately suspended pending federal investigation, and I am personally committed to ensuring that accountability is swift, comprehensive, and meaningful. The federal response was immediate and devastating, with Department of Justice Civil Rights Division attorneys arriving within 24 hours to investigate violations so clear and egregious that criminal prosecution was inevitable. The viral video had created undeniable evidence of federal crimes committed against a disabled veteran, making denial impossible and accountability essential for maintaining constitutional credibility. This incident represents willful violation of federal civil rights law by law enforcement officers who tortured a disabled veteran for exercising accommodation rights that his military service had earned, announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Chin during a federal press conference. The video evidence documents crimes that demand both individual prosecution and institutional reform. But the most meaningful intervention came from an unexpected source, the grassroots organization of Metro City residents who had been outraged by Marcus's video and demanded immediate action from city leadership. Their mobilization was swift and comprehensive, with thousands of citizens attending emergency city council meetings while organizing boycotts of public transportation until meaningful reforms were implemented. The community response transcended political boundaries as veterans, disability advocates, civil rights organizations, and ordinary citizens united in demanding justice for Michael, while holding their city accountable for institutional failures that had enabled the assault. The coalition was powerful and persistent, creating political pressure that made cosmetic responses impossible. We will not accept thoughts and prayers or administrative leave as adequate response to the torture of a disabled veteran, declared Vietnam veteran Robert Martinez during the emergency city council session that drew over 2,000 attendees. This city will implement real reform or face the consequences of citizen action that holds institutions accountable for protecting rather than persecuting those who protected America. The policy changes that emerged were comprehensive and unprecedented, with Metro City implementing the most extensive police and transit worker training program in the United States, focused specifically on disability rights, veteran accommodation, and de-escalation techniques that prevented rather than created civil rights violations. The training curriculum was developed in partnership with veteran organizations, disability rights groups, and legal experts who ensured that programs addressed root causes rather than symptoms of institutional prejudice. Every Metro City employee, from bus drivers to police officers to administrative staff, would complete 40 hours of disability accommodation education before returning to public-facing duties. We're not just changing policies, we're changing culture, Mayor Williams announced during the rollout of Metro City's Disability Rights Excellence Initiative. Every city employee will understand that serving disabled citizens, especially veterans, isn't just legal obligation, it's moral imperative that reflects our deepest American values. The legal resolution was swift and decisive, with officers Mills and Foster facing federal civil rights charges carrying up to 10 years in prison for willfully violating the constitutional rights of a disabled veteran. The charges were enhanced by hate crime statutes that recognized attacks on disabled individuals as bias crimes, requiring maximum penalties. Michael's recovery was gradual and complicated, with months of rehabilitation addressing both physical injuries from the taser assault and psychological trauma that had undone years of PTSD treatment progress. The attack had triggered exactly the kind of institutional mistrust that kept many veterans isolated from civilian services, requiring comprehensive therapeutic intervention to rebuild confidence in public spaces. But Liberty's recovery became symbol of resilience and hope, with veterinary neurologists documenting gradual improvement in her cognitive and motor functions, while her bond with Michael actually strengthened through their shared trauma. The partnership that officers had tried to destroy through violence emerged stronger and more determined to prove that service animal relationships could survive even the worst institutional failures. The educational impact was immediate and far-reaching, with Metro City's reform model being adopted by transportation systems throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. The comprehensive training programs influenced federal transit policy while creating new standards for disability accommodation that protected vulnerable citizens from discrimination and violence. The financial accountability was equally significant, with the federal civil rights settlement providing $7 million in damages while funding ongoing monitoring that ensured reforms were implemented rather than merely promised. The cost to taxpayers became object lesson about the expense of discrimination and the value of preventing rather than responding to civil rights violations. The medical research that documented Michael and Liberty's recovery contributed to academic understanding of electrical trauma and service animal partnerships, while their experience became case study for therapeutic approaches that addressed trauma caused by institutional failures. The findings influenced VA treatment protocols while advancing understanding of how civil rights violations could create medical emergencies requiring specialized intervention. The media legacy continued through annual coverage of Metro City's transformation, with national outlets documenting how viral documentation of injustice had created accountability that traditional oversight had failed to achieve. The story became model for how social media could amplify civil rights violations while creating pressure for meaningful reform. Marcus Chen's role in documenting the assault earned recognition that transformed him from high school student to disability rights advocate, with his technical expertise helping other disabled citizens document discrimination while holding institutions accountable through social media pressure that translated into policy changes. 3 years later, Metro City had become a national model for disability accommodation and veteran services, with transportation systems that exceeded federal requirements, while creating inclusive environments that served all citizens with dignity and respect. The city that had been embarrassed by police brutality became celebrated for its commitment to civil rights excellence. The annual Michael Santos Veterans Rights Day became a national observance that honored service animal partnerships while educating transportation workers about accommodation requirements and constitutional obligations. The event attracted visitors from throughout the country while generating economic activity that demonstrated how moral leadership could create positive change. The final scene was both personal vindication and institutional transformation. Michael stood with Liberty, now fully recovered and working as therapy team in addition to service dog duties, at the dedication of Metro City's Michael Santos Transit Accessibility Center, a facility that provided comprehensive support for disabled travelers while training transportation workers in accommodation excellence. Liberty and I didn't choose to become symbols of what's wrong with how disabled veterans are treated. Michael reflected during the dedication ceremony, attended by hundreds of supporters who had followed their journey from assault to advocacy. But we chose to transform our trauma into changes that protect others from experiencing what we survived. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't won on foreign battlefields, they're achieved when communities decide that protecting constitutional rights is more important than protecting institutions that violate them. The audience, including Mayor Williams' federal officials who had prosecuted the officers and disability advocates from throughout the country, understood that they were witnessing resolution of a story that had transformed both individual lives and institutional systems, proving that when courage met accountability, even the most entrenched discrimination could be overcome through community commitment to constitutional principles. The Michael Santos and Liberty incident became a watershed moment for disability rights in public transportation and law enforcement accountability, establishing legal precedents and training requirements that protected thousands of disabled citizens while fundamentally changing how transit systems approached service animal accommodation throughout the United States. The immediate consequences revolutionized public transportation practices nationwide, with the Department of Transportation mandating comprehensive disability rights training for all federally funded transit systems within 18 months. The program reached over 250,000 transportation workers while preventing countless discrimination incidents through enhanced understanding of constitutional obligations and accommodation requirements. The federal prosecutions resulted in the first criminal convictions, specifically targeting law enforcement officers who violated service animal rights, with Officers Mills and Foster receiving federal prison sentences of 4 and 3 years respectively. The prosecutions established precedent that constitutional violations against disabled veterans would face serious criminal consequences regardless of claimed procedural compliance. The Americans with Disabilities Act Enforcement Enhancement Act, directly inspired by Michael's case, created specific criminal penalties for assaulting service animals, while mandating federal oversight of state and local transportation systems. The legislation influenced international disability rights policy while providing legal framework that protected disabled travelers throughout the transportation network. The public transportation transformation was swift and comprehensive, with transit systems investing over $500 million in disability accommodation improvements that included staff training, facility modifications, and technology development. The changes created new standards for accessibility while demonstrating that inclusive design improved service quality for all passengers. The law enforcement training revolution extended beyond transportation to encompass comprehensive disability rights instruction for all police academies, with Michael's case becoming required study for peace officer certification. The training influenced academy curricula while establishing professional standards that recognize disability accommodation as core law enforcement responsibility. The social media accountability movement gained national momentum through Marcus's documentation, with his live streaming techniques being taught to disability advocates throughout the country as tools for holding institutions accountable when traditional oversight failed. The model influenced citizen journalism while creating new pathways for amplifying civil rights violations. The medical research that emerged from documenting the recovery process contributed to treatment protocols for electrical trauma and service animal rehabilitation, while validating the essential nature of human-animal partnerships for managing complex disabilities. The findings influenced VA medical practice and civilian healthcare while advancing understanding of therapeutic animal relationships. The cultural impact transformed public understanding of veteran disabilities and the consequences of institutional ignorance about constitutional rights. Michael's story educated millions about PTSD service animal training and the challenges faced by disabled veterans, while demonstrating that accommodation was right rather than privilege earned through military service. The economic development that resulted from Metro City's transformation attracted new businesses and residents who recognized the city's commitment to inclusion and accessibility. The model influenced urban planning throughout Pennsylvania, while demonstrating that civil rights excellence could create competitive advantages for communities committed to serving all citizens. The enduring message transcended individual triumph to encompass fundamental truths about American democracy. Constitutional rights required active enforcement rather than passive recognition. Institutional accountability demanded citizen engagement rather than bureaucratic oversight, and the strongest communities were those that protected rather than persecuted their most vulnerable members through commitment to justice that exceeded mere legal compliance.